Hello, this is Christian, and let's draw something interesting. In the previous videos, I had drawn mountains something like this. This is sort of the style that I've developed over time, and I'd showed how the color and the shading and the highlighting gets in there. And what I want to do today is show you a different style of mountain, a style that I've recognized from this gentleman here, not George R. R. Martin, but the guy who drew these maps for the Lands of Ice and Fire map set. This is drawn by a guy named Jonathan Roberts, who is from the UK, but I think lives in New York City at the moment. And he goes by the name Torstan sometimes, and has a website called Fantastic Maps, and a YouTube channel where he has some tutorials under the name Fantastic Maps. And so he makes mountains that look a bit more like this. These are some attempts of mine to draw Torstan style mountains, Jonathan Roberts style mountains. And I wanted to show how that process goes, and how you can use similar techniques to get different looks out of your fantasy map making. So the kind of pen that I had used before to draw this sort of mountain is what I call my tech pen, which is rather pixely, hard-edged, relatively hard-edged, not super anti-aliased. I really like the blend of how fuzzy the edges are and are not, if you take my meaning. But with the Torstan style, his line is finer and he uses fewer of them. So I've created this little pen here, which is similar. I can show you what the attributes are. It's got a slight fuzziness, solid grain here, and the big difference between it and what I use now is it has this slight difference in opacity and size that are governed by the pressure of the pencil. So if I have it down, say like 20% here, and opacity, let's see, so I can get a nice, really fine, sort of semi-transparent line, push a little harder, and I can get a thicker line. So it has a slightly more refined, slightly less blocky look than the pen that I've been using. So in one of Jonathan's excellent tutorials, he shows how he'll start drawing a ridge line with the line here, and he'll come on down and squiggle around a bit. I don't want to get too complicated and kind of trail off. Now, my instinct is always to put lots of these little dots, lots of these little contour lines here and there, and Torstan is a little bit more refined about where he puts his lines down, because he knows, I think, that he's going to get a lot of detail from the way he does his shading later. So he doesn't need to put down quite as many contour lines right off the bat. And so I'm going to try to be real restrained here and not put too many of these contour lines down, just indicating where I want the ridge line to go, making this look like a sort of a connected multiple mountain range kind of thing. And I don't have perfect control over this technique yet, so this is just sort of me imitating his technique and showing you how you can achieve different results. And he's not as picky about keeping his lines connected as I am, but when you experiment and use a different person's style for a time, what you're doing is you're trying to learn how they do what they do, how they see their canvas, and how they achieve their look. And it's a good exercise to go through. It doesn't mean that you're trying to copy them. It doesn't mean that you're trying to take their place or anything. It just means that you're trying to learn from them. And artists have been doing this since people were painting on cave walls as Neanderthals and stuff. You know, you imitate what the previous artist did and you try to learn from their technique. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to control myself a little bit and not do too many of these contour lines, not be too crazy about it. And I'm going to restrain myself from doing these perpendicular lines that I do a lot of, because I'm going to get some of that out of the technique of adding the shading and the highlighting. So just kind of laying this down like this. If you hear some thumping in the background, that is my upstairs neighbors. They are, I think, drilling something at the moment, which is a little annoying, but hopefully you can't hear it. Okay, so once we have some inks down, we've got those on our inks layer, it's a multiply layer, then the next step is to lay down some highlights and shadows. And the way I had shown that happening before was with a multiply shadow layer and an add or linear dodge highlight layer. The way Torstan likes to do it is with an overlay layer. Overlay is pretty cool. It's pretty efficient. And the way it works is, if I go to my Torstan shader here, this is a pen that if I was to do it on the ink layer, it would look like this. So it's nice and semi-transparent, good for shading. If I do it on the overlay layer, you see it's looking like that. And what it's doing is it acts, if you don't know, overlay acts as multiply if the tone that you're laying down is darker than 50% gray, and it acts as a screen if the tone you're laying down is lighter than 50% gray. So it's sort of like multiply and screen together. So I'm going to take my Torstan shader, and what I'm doing first is going to, following his sort of tutorial, I'm going to block in areas of big simple shadow, and I'm going to try and do it with nice unpicky, you know, not as I don't know how to say it. You know, he uses a really practiced, efficient shading technique when he shows his tutorials, because he's been doing this a very long time and it's very easy for him at this point. And you know, I do more fussy work because I don't trust my shading or trust my line quite as much as he does. So what I'm trying to do is just train myself not to be quite as fussy and just kind of lay down these shadows where they should go and get some definition on this mountain range, and not worry too much if it looks like, oh, there's a stroke, stroke, stroke. Yeah, it's going to kind of look like that, and that's okay. This is, again, on the overlay layer, adding in basic shadow. Okay, still on the overlay layer, just switch to white, and now, using the same pen, same shader, now you're laying down highlight. So on one single overlay layer, you've got both your highlight and your shadow. And again, I'm just doing nice, big, wide blocks wherever I think the shadow should go. I'm sorry, where the highlight should go at this point. All right. And so this is how it's blending into the ground. Like with my ink heavy style up here, I'm blending it into the ground like this. And this ink heavy style is good for things that are like line art, where you're not going to have a lot of gray tones, even though I sometimes color it in with gray tones. This mountain stands alone real well by itself without tone in it because it has so much detail line on it. But this style, Torstan's cool style, works really well in full color, and the mountain is blending in to the ground with the highlight. And so I'm going, bright and vertical up near the peaks, and horizontal and very light down near the ground. Then I've got, what do you know, another overlay layer. It just happens to be up above here, and I could do this on the previous overlay layer, but sometimes it's good to have just another one on top. And I'm going to do the same thing with the same brush in the same process, just with a smaller size. See, I'm reducing my brush size down to like less than half. And what I'm going to do is on this overlay layer, which is on top of the other overlay layer, I'm going to add the heavier, even smaller, there we go, the heavier shadows. Oops. And if you go too much, just, back off. I'm trying to sort of push down hard and just kind of let it trail off and give myself some good heavy shadow coming off the peak. So this is where I'm doing the detail shadow work. And so if I pick a little spot like that and give it a nice heavy shadow coming off, spot like that, nice heavy shadow. This is a nice little sort of gully or little valley here, so this should be some pretty heavy shadow here. And I'm going kind of quickly here, so not all of this is going to be perfect, but I'm going from the edges, from the topmost part of the mountain, and I'm throwing down these nice hard shadows on top of the shadows that I've already laid down. And by doing this, you are picking out the peaks, picking out the areas of shadow, and you're tricking the eye into making this into a three-dimensional object like we were doing before. So I'm just kind of going by where I think the shadows would be. And by doing it on a separate layer here, it allows me to sometimes lay this new shadow on top of where I had accidentally put a little extra too much highlight, before. So I get some nice heavy shadows coming off here, and these shadows are sort of blending into the ground here, making this look like it really sits on the ground. Get some heavier shadow here. Now I could have done all of this on the one single overlay layer, but again, sometimes it's better to have just an extra layer on top. Now we're going to go to the highlights, and we're just going to, sometimes it get a little extreme, and you're just going to find the areas that need a highlight right up near the top. We're giving this narrower, more precise looking highlights coming down. And so this is in place of extra contour lines. I'm winding up with the suggestion of contour lines just by where these highlights are falling, and it's actually a little bit faster, I think, than the technique that I was kind of using before. Now, because I've used this parchment layer down below, what I'm essentially doing with these overlay layers is these overlays are all applying to this parchment. So the parchment, if I make it go away, it's just got a white background and there's nothing happening. Bring the parchment back, and suddenly the overlays are applying to it, and they're making these shadows and making these highlights against the parchment. The parchment is a parchment that I mixed together, I think a few years ago, just using techniques in Photoshop and downloading some free textures and stuff, and mixing it all together into this big multi-purpose parchment that I can just lay down behind anything that I need a nice parchmenty background to. And when you're doing overlays, in order for the overlay to have some bite to it, you need to have some tone back there. It can't just be pure white. The overlay needs something to grab onto to lighten and to darken. So you need to have some layer down there. So make yourself a parchment layer. The next thing that Torstan likes to do is on a color layer. Color is a type of blend mode over here that allows you to change the hue of the thing underneath. And so if you pick a nice solid gray or even a black with no color content to it, and you take that same shader, what you're doing now is you're pulling color out or desaturating the parchment background. And the reason we're doing this is, again, the idea that mountains are going to be stonier, more granite-like, stonier, more rocky, and they're not going to be quite as brownish and dirt-like as the surrounding landscape. So you're coloring with black, essentially, or coloring with gray, something without color on it, and you're doing that on top. You're doing that on a color layer, and that's pulling saturation out of the parchment layer or whatever your ground layer is beneath it. And this is also helping the mountain to sort of jump out of the plane that it's sitting on. Coloring with something that's gray on a color layer is in fact pulling saturation out. One thing that Torstan likes to do is likes to have some blue in the shadows. So bluish shadows will tend to recede and look colder. So if we come in here and we very gently can shade in a little bit of blue into this shadowy area, it's going to make those shadows look a little bit more interesting and look a little bit cooler and help trick the eye even more that they're receding. So this process, as you can see, it's producing a different look to the mountain than my look. And if I go even further here, I could do what I call a texture. I have this texture thing here, this pen that does a thing like that. The way that it does it is, it has a shape source like this and a grain source like that. And so if I go into my overlay mode again and I throw down some big strokes of texture coming off like that, it gives it a nice look, nice rough look, adding some texture on top of the parchment texture below. We can even do that in the highlights. Again, I'm doing this on the overlay layer, just throwing down a little extra texture. So with this process, with Torstan's process, and you can follow his tutorial, he's got a very good one on YouTube, you can produce cool looking mountains like these. This is sort of a blend of his technique and my technique. This is just me practicing, and the more practicing you do, the better everything will look. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.